For this unit, you're going to watch a two-part lecture. So this is lecture 6, part 1, which is about religion and ritual. And these are topics which really have been a subject of interest to anthropologists since the very beginning of the field. So what we'll do in part 1 of the lecture is talk about some of the key concepts and findings in anthropology about religion and ritual. Once you've watched this, you'll move on to lecture 6, part 2, which is about health and healing, which I think you'll find is in many ways connected to the subjects of religion and ritual. So we'll talk about each of these related subjects in turn across the two parts of the lecture. So any discussion of this subject needs to start with just trying to even define the topic, which, as you read in the text for this week, is not always that easy, right? What exactly we mean by religion is not always clear, and part of the reason for that is that it's variable cross-culturally, and the very concepts that we might use to define religion are very culturally specific. So it's hard to come up with a definition that holds everywhere. That said, here's sort of a working definition, which is that we can talk about religion as beliefs and actions related to powerful forces and beings, okay? With the understanding that those powerful forces and beings are beyond direct human experience, that they are in some sense, quote-unquote, supernatural. Now, that may seem like a fairly straightforward definition, but it immediately poses a couple of questions. So the first is, well, if we're talking about something being supernatural, then that implies that we have a clear sense of what the line is that separates natural and supernatural. And again, the fact is that that's not always a clear line. It's often not a clear line at all. And in some cultural worlds, for example, the natural world is invested with various kinds of spiritual beings, right? So the notion that there's a natural world and a supernatural world already carries with it certain sorts of particularly Western cultural assumptions. So we want to be very careful about that. Likewise, there's sort of an implication here that we're clear on the difference between that which is sacred and that which is profane, right? That there's a separate sort of sphere of human experience or human practice that is that of the sacred. And again, depending on the setting and depending also on the particular, the individual life, those things may be tangled up together. So again, this is a working definition, but my point here is that we need to take it with a grain of salt and bear in mind that we're going to find lots of examples that complicate that definition. Now, so if we're talking about, again, religion being about people engaging with supernatural forces and beings, we can also start to look at some of the variations, the sort of cultural diversity across those supernatural forces and beings. So, in other words, even if we can sort of grab onto that as part of our definition, we need to certainly recognize that there's a lot of variability. So, just as we talked about the difficulty of making a distinction between the natural and the supernatural, we find that those supernatural forces and beings take different forms. So, for example, in some religious settings, those supernatural beings are understood as gods, either a god or multiple gods, right? Beings who are understood to be sort of inherently beyond the mortal realm. But in other cultural contexts, we find that people engage with, again, supernatural beings who are understood to be spirits in the sense of being an aspect of what it means to be a human being. So, for example, my own fieldwork is primarily in Southern Africa, which is a part of the world where people very much continue to engage with the spirits of their deceased relatives after those people pass on. So the question then becomes, are those natural or supernatural beings, right? They're clearly supernatural in their form as spirits, but they're, again, they're connected to a living person, right? The idea is more that people don't cease to be after their death, but continue to play a role in their relatives' lives. People communicate with those spirits. Sometimes those spirits come and possess other people and speak directly. So again, this is just to say that we find a lot of kind of slippery categories when we start thinking about religion. Likewise, we can look at those supernatural forces and beings as sometimes being anthropomorphic, meaning that they take the form of or are similar to humans, right? And that could apply to the figure of a god or the figure of a spirit that used to be, a human being who has now died and takes a different form. But there are also supernatural forces that are much more abstract, where, again, it's not understood to be sort of a person or a persona with a personality, but it's understood to be a sort of supernatural force that can act on the world. So again, we find some continuity. I think it's fair to say that we have a sense that religion is a distinctive area of human experience. But again, it just takes a lot of different forms. All right, so having sort of roughly defined our topic, let's talk about some of the key ways in which anthropologists have tried to make sense of what religion is and how people practice religion. So I want to run through some of the key concepts that are part of the anthropology of religion. One of the most important concepts is the idea of symbols. So a symbol is simply, the way I put it here is it's sort of a storage unit or a vehicle of cultural meaning, okay? So it's something that stands for something else and therefore can be deployed to bear that meaning in whatever context that symbol appears in, okay? These symbols are also the building blocks of ritual, which we'll talk about in a second, right? So we know that symbols are an important component of every aspect of human cultural life, right? Language is one of the most obvious examples. We talked about that earlier in the course. Language is almost, the best working definition we could have of what a symbol is and how symbols operate, right? The sounds that we make that are what we understand to be words are symbols that stand for meaning, right? That is the whole basis of how we're able to communicate, is through this symbolic system, right? So religion is another area of human experience and human practice where symbols are really important, right? And we really see them in action, if you will. So, on the slide here, these are some symbols associated with some major world religions, right? And these are symbols that you will find used in the context of religious practice. Now, to think a little bit more about symbols and what they do and why they're important, I wanted to call a little bit on the work of an important anthropologist of religion named Victor Turner. And Turner did a lot of work in his primary field site was in Zambia, in Africa. And he was interested in various things that we consider to be a part of religion, including symbols and ritual and some other stuff. So he did a lot of theorizing of how symbols operate. And I wanted to give you a few of the kinds of conclusions that Turner came to regarding symbols, what's important to know about symbols. And I'm not so concerned about you, for example, memorizing these terms that he uses, but to help you understand better how symbols do their thing. Okay, so that's the reason for telling you this. It's not to get too bogged down in the theory. So Turner, and what I've got represented on this slide is Turner found some key qualities of symbols. And the three that I want to talk about are these ones called condensation, unification, and polarization. Okay, and again, don't worry too much about the jargon here, but try to understand the meaning of, helping you to understand what symbols are and how they operate. So, in terms of the idea that symbols, one of their qualities is condensation. One of the things that Turner noticed is that symbols don't just carry one meaning, but they often carry a bunch of meanings. That's the idea of condensation. So lots of different things and actions can be sort of crammed into a symbol. This is one of the reasons he found that symbols are so important and so powerful, okay? So they bring together multiple meanings in the same, again, whether it's an image or an object or a gesture, whatever form the symbol takes. A second quality of symbols is what he called the unification of disparate significata, which sounds way more complicated than it actually is. And the idea with this part is that one of the ways that symbols kind of cram together a bunch of related meanings is to basically draw associations or demonstrate analogies between those things. So, for example, this is one of the examples he gives in his work on the Ndembu people in Zambia. So I have an image on the right here from one of his books. He wrote a lot of books. But so one of the things he found in studying ritual among the Ndembu people was that in the initiation rituals that are the rite through which girls basically ritually become women, he found that in those rites, the Ndembu made use of a tree that produces a white milky sap, right? So during these rituals, the ritual would take place near that tree, and the sap of the tree would play a role in the ritual. And what he found was that that tree and its white sap then allowed for the rite to bring together several meanings. So it signified women, it signified breast milk, it signified motherhood, and it also signified the matrilineage. Remember, we talked about the importance of how families are organized and the idea that families sort of grow along certain lines of descent, right? So these particular people are matrilineal, meaning belonging in the family passes from mothers to daughters, right? So this one symbol, right, the sap of this tree, called up all these various meanings and allowed them to be connected to one another and deployed in this ritual setting, okay? And then the third quality that he pointed out that I want to touch on is the idea of polarization of meaning. What Turner found is that symbols tend to have what he called two poles. Okay, so that's two sort of aspects to them. The ideological pole is the aspect that has to do with cultural values, right? Or sort of moral or social ideas or ideologies, okay? The other pole, which he called the sensory pole, has to do with sensory experience, right? So the sort of material or physical sort of components of something, or what it feels like to experience something in your body or in your emotion. And what he found is symbols often have both of those things, okay? These are like two complementary parts of the symbol. There's the ideological part and there's the sensory part. And what he suggested is it's precisely because of that combination, again, that symbols are so powerful and so effective in what they do. Because there's an experiential side where you live something or you feel something or you enact something. And in that process, you're also essentially engaging with a key cultural value or a key idea, okay? Let me give you an example of that, because I know that sounds a little abstract. And again, the point of the stuff on this slide is that this is Victor Turner, the anthropologist, who's gone out into the field, right? Spent a lot of time around people doing stuff, and he's trying to analyze it. He's trying to make sense of it. That's what building theory is about, right? So he's coming up with a sort of a conceptual model for understanding the things that people actually do in the real world. So that's what this is about, all right? So this polarization of meaning idea, right? That there's an ideological and a sensory component to a symbol. So one of the things I thought of as an example of that is something like incense, right? Think about, again, religious or ritual contexts. We know that in many religions the world over, that incense plays a part. That, across different religions, you find people again, either during religious services or ritual services, burning incense, all right? And it's a good example of that kind of both ideological and sensory component of a symbol coming together. So the ideological parts, and incense doesn't mean the exact same thing everywhere that you find people burning incense, but it has some sort of general meanings we find across a lot of contexts. So often the burning of incense is connected to cleansing or purifying a space, particularly preparing a sacred space. It can also be used as sort of an offering. In some places, there's even the associated idea of, in a religious setting, that prayers rising up, right? Sort of like the smoke from an incense burner rises up. So these are the sort of ideological meanings, right? The substantive cultural meanings that are attached to incense. So that's the ideological pole. But then what you also have simultaneous with that is the sensory experience of smelling that aroma, right? If you walk into a church where incense burning is part of the practice there, you smell that and it becomes a physical experience that also then reminds you of and calls up all those other cultural meanings. So the combination of those meanings and that physical experience tied together in the symbol. So, as I said, symbols are, in addition to just being important in their own right, are also the building blocks of something we call ritual. Again, a important part of religious practice the world over. What we mean when we talk about ritual is, and again, here's a sort of working definition, is that it's patterned actions that carry symbolic meaning and work transformations, okay? So there's sort of three important parts to that then. Patterned actions, okay? So when we talk about ritual, we talk about people doing things. Religion, often I think the first thing we think of when we think about religion is sort of concepts, right? And like sort of the big ideas, the big belief systems around religion. What we don't want to forget is that religion is also something you do. And the form that that doing takes is often ritual, okay? So it's action and it's patterned. It's action that you do in a very specific way. So that's the first thing, right? It's symbolic, right? So it does carry big meanings that go to some of those big belief systems that we think about when we think about religion. But they're being carried forward through, again, specific kinds of actions. And this is crucial too, ritual is transformative. It changes the world, all right? That's why people do rituals. They do rituals to accomplish something, all right? So there's a sort of, if you want to think of it, it's almost like a practical end. You want to do something to the world through ritual. Given that, we see certain kinds of things attached to ritual the world over, all right? Because it's important that you do ritual in a certain way, right? Like you don't just wing it, right? Like usually ritual, there's a set way to do stuff. So we often find that there are specialized elements that are utilized in ritual context. It could be special objects. It could be certain words or phrases that people intone. It might be certain ways of moving your body. It might be certain clothing. It could be all of those. But there's something different, something special, something purposeful about a ritual. People often have to sort of prepare for a ritual, right? They need to put on special clothes or set up an altar or whatever it may be, okay? The second set of things that we often find connected to ritual is a group experience, all right? That's what I'm alluding to with these phrases, collective effervescence and communitas. Your book mentions these two phrases. And these are also a really important part of what it feels like to be part of a group doing a ritual, all right? So as the book says, that collective effervescence, which is such a great phrase, is that feeling of being in a group of people going through a sort of emotionally transformative experience together, all right? So there's a sort of, the idea that there's a sort of a feeling of heightened experience across a group of people, right? If you've ever been in any kind of ritual setting, in a church service or anything else like that, right? You know that there are moments where it's not just what's going on around you, but it's doing that in the context of being with other people who are also doing the same thing, okay? Communitas is similar to that in certain ways. We're going to talk about communitas a little bit more in a minute, but communitas is even more specifically that sense of shared, interpersonal shared experience that takes place in the context of ritual, but including and especially when the ritual involves basically going through some kind of ordeal together. Some of the rituals, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes, are transformative in a way that means that people have to experience something either scary or alienating or difficult. And going through that as a group bonds those people together. All right. So that's that feeling of communitas, that you create something like community or lifelong relationships by having experienced this challenging, transformative thing together. Okay. And the final element of ritual that I wanted to note is that in many places, most places in the world, when there's ritual, there are ritual experts. That is, there are people who know more about it and either lead the process, or sometimes they're the only ones who can do it, right? They have either a specialized knowledge or a special spiritual capacity themselves that allows them to do it, right? So it's often the case that there's somebody who is a specialist who is on hand when ritual's being conducted. And again, that's sort of a general pattern, but the form of those ritual experts is really varied, right? So I just gave a few examples here on the bottom. On the left is a man who is a priest in Haitian voodoo. The ritual practitioners in Haitian voodoo have relationships with a pantheon of spirits who come and possess them. And this priest here is pictured sort of, again, in the specialized clothing of the spirit that guides his work. In the middle is, of course, the Catholic clergy, right? Pope. So again, specialized clothing, specialized role, a particular sort of spiritual orientation. And on the right is a Mongolian shaman. Excuse me. So shamans are individuals who their specialty is to travel in a spiritual way to another realm. And from that traveling that they do, they're able to bring back information and often help people with of overlap between what we consider religion and what we consider health and healing. So a lot of these ritual experts, who we might consider religious practitioners, are also healers. That is, they are helping people deal with misfortunes of various kinds, including illness. Okay, so now I want to break down ritual a little bit more. What I've been presenting to now is some broader ideas about ritual, but as your book says, we can talk about particular varieties of ritual. One of the most important, and one that has been written about a lot in anthropology, including by Victor Turner, who I mentioned earlier, is what are called rites of passage. And rites of passage are a particular sort of ritual that is utilized to transition somebody from one social status to another. That is sort of what it accomplishes. And it happens, these rites of passage happen at various points across an individual's life course. But one of the most obvious places where we see a lot of rites of passage taking place is in the transition from adolescence to adulthood, or what is presumed to be adulthood. So in societies the world over and in various religions, we find some kind of initiation rite, right? Where people, again, when they're basically, adolescents or young teens, go through some kind of ritual practice. That is the moment where they sort of say goodbye to being children and are recognized as adults, or at least young adults, right? So the images here are all examples of those kinds of rites of passage, transitioning from childhood to adulthood. And one of the things that is notable about rites of passage, and this is one of the things that Victor Turner wrote about a lot, is that no matter where they happen, or like in what society or what religious context, they have a common form. And it's a 3-step process. Step 1 is separation. Step 2 is transition, which is a state that Victor Turner referred to as liminality. And step 3 is reintegration. So the idea is that essentially the ritual process of that transition or of that transformation is the young person is sort of taken out of their normal social context. They go through this sort of betwixt and between phase where they are in a quote unquote liminal state. That means that they are they've left the first part of their life, but they haven't yet arrived at the second part. There's this sort of kind of in-between period, or a limbo period. And then having gone through that experience, they are reintegrated back into their home society, but with a new status, with a new identity. Okay? So these images, quinceañera, this is a bar mitzvah, and this is a coming of age rite in the African country of Malawi. So again, they look different, but they're all doing a similar kind of thing. For Victor Turner, the middle phase of this state of liminality was the most interesting, because one of the things he noticed is during that middle phase, all kinds of interesting things happen. In many places, when initiates go through that phase, they act in strange ways, they wear strange clothes, they may learn about taboo subjects, they may be able to talk back to their elders in ways that are not normally acceptable. All this stuff is sort of up for grabs. And this, Turner thought, was one of the key elements of how rites of passage affect the change that they do, right? That you have to sort of break the first mold of who you are or who you were before you can construct the new mold of who you will be and who you will be reintegrated back into your society as. Your book mentions a couple of other kinds of rite that I think are worth mentioning. So rites of intensification are rites where, again, people go through a kind of trial or an ordeal in order to transform the world around them. So they gave you this example in the book of this practice called land diving in Vanuatu. One of the things that I think is important to bear in mind about this and about all rituals is even if it tends to focus on particular individuals, right? So in this case, young men engage in this rite. The fact is it's about the entire community, right? So it's certain individuals whose status is changing or who are affecting a change in the world. But the fact is lots of other people, the rest of their family, etc., participate in that. And it's a transformation for everyone, okay? So rites of intensification, another kind of rite. Your book also mentions what are sometimes called rites of revitalization. They're also sometimes called cargo cults. And these are quite fascinating rites. Again, we find them in various places in the world where and it often is connected to certain kinds of events or historical moments in the society that continues to practice that rite, which are about the rites that are understood to call forth either riches or wealth or something to come to the people who practice that rite. So the one that was mentioned in your book, for example, is very much in response to the presence of Americans during World War II. So it's got sort of a historical referent. And one of the ways that again, both that historical moment and this idea of revitalization is symbolized is through things like people wearing blue jeans, right? And adorning their bodies with USA. So you'll find, again, various varieties of rituals, but they have certain things in common, which have to do with, again, changing the world around the practitioners of those rituals. All right. So I wanted to end with talking a little bit about the article you read by Dubish, which is also about ritual. And I would suggest a ritual that is a rite of passage, right? And it's also very much a pilgrimage, which we can also talk about, which is another sort of component of ritual practice. And I think one of the important things about the Dubish article is that it reminds us that, we're talking about ritual in the context of religion in this unit, but ritual, I think, is an idea that can be extended beyond the purely religious context, right? So the event that Dubish is talking about, the Run for the Wall, is not obviously a religious event. It's a pretty secular event, but nonetheless, it has, again, all those hallmarks of ritual that we can talk about in other more obviously religious settings. So the Run for the Wall, as you read about, is the name given to a yearly event wherein Vietnam veterans and their family members and supporters and others make a cross-country journey on motorcycles to ultimately arrive at the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. And it's something that's conducted for at least a couple of reasons. For many of the veterans, it's an act of personal healing. As you read, a lot of people have ongoing, long-standing sort of effects from having been in the war, including the trauma of PTSD, etc. So part of it is that, right? So a sort of personal journey for people. There's also the political issue of missing in action soldiers that is one of the things that people are addressing by participating in this. So again, this is a secular event that very much takes the form of ritual. It is first and foremost a pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is a ritual act that involves a journey. And often a pilgrimage, part of it is reaching a certain destination. So we will find, again, the world over, that there are pilgrimages to various sacred sites where you are going to, where you are arriving at, is itself a very important place in that cosmology or in that religion. But part of the idea too with pilgrimage is it's not just getting there; it's the process of traveling there is also extremely important. So the journeying, right, the time spent getting somewhere, and that's very much the case for the Run for the Wall, where yes, getting to the memorial is important, and that space at the wall is very important. But as important is that long process of driving across the country. Part of the reason it's very significant is all the things that happen to people along the way. There's a lot of exchange and bonding among the people traveling together in the Run for the Wall. There's also a lot of support and interaction with the communities that the Run for the Wall passes through. So there's sort of multiple ways in which people are reflecting on and engaging with their experience in the wall and afterwards. I think we can very much also talk about the Run for the Wall as a rite of passage, right? It has that sort of transformative effect on people. Certainly, while they are in process, while they are journeying from one place to another, people are in a sort of liminal state. They are, they've left their more typical status, and they haven't yet arrived at that new status of, again, healing or closure or whatever it may be that they are seeking. There certainly is also a great deal of communitas, right? Remember we talked about how people who go through an ordeal together in a ritual setting, there's a sort of bonding that takes place. There's a creation of a sort of community around that experience. And certainly the Run for the Wall is an excellent example of that. And then when the travelers arrive at the wall, right, in Washington, D.C., it's also treated as a sort of sacred place, and very much almost as if it is a shrine. So people bring various kinds of offerings that they leave at the wall. They engage with the wall in certain places. So basically all, wrapped up in this one, again, secular event are many, many of the hallmarks of religious ritual that we find in many places in the world. So I think it's a great example for thinking through how ritual operates, again, whether within or beyond the religious context. So I will leave you with that to reflect on religion and ritual, and even applying concepts around religion and ritual to other kinds of issues like this one.